So thank you for coming this morning. Today I'm going to be talking about volcanoes. How many of you knew there were volcanoes in Alaska? Okay, good, most of you. There's actually more volcanic activity in Alaska than just about any other place on the planet. We'll be talking about glaciers, volcanoes, and wildlife to get you ready for tomorrow, Tracy Arm Fjord. How many of you know what a fjord is? It's an automobile. First automobile created. Very good, very good. He'll be playing tonight in the Firebird Lounge. I recognize you. There's a couple people who have been on this ship for a long time, right? How many people have been here since Australia? Yeah, I think there's only 4 of you. There's a lady here. She's been to all my talks, so she's come to know Nancy Caruso. So today we're talking about the wildlife, the volcanoes, and glaciers of Alaska. Fire and ice, essentially, the components that make up the ever-changing landscape of Alaska. I am a marine biologist. I'll be with you on the whole cruise. When you hear my voice on the PA system all day tomorrow, I'll be up on the bridge looking for wildlife throughout most of the cruise. So if you are interested in wildlife, tune in to channel 36. If you miss a presentation, I'll be on 24 hours a day. You can watch, you can go to sleep with Nancy on your TV. You can leave channel 19 on, because that's just the picture of the bow, what the bow camera sees. But my voice will come across channel 19 in your cabin. If I see some whales or some wildlife, I'll broadcast across channel 19, so you'll hear it. You can run outside and look for whatever I'm seeing. I'm your naturalist on board. A naturalist is an expert or a student of natural history. I like to call myself a student of natural history. And you may have run into naturalists. Anybody in here a naturalist? Because there are now big push to make certification classes for naturalists. When I'm not on the ship, I'm only on the ship a few weeks a year, but when I'm not on the ship, I run a nonprofit organization back in California. I work underwater restoring the kelp forests of Southern California, and I do this by teaching kids how to grow these organisms in their classrooms: the giant kelp, the white sea bass, the abalone, and putting them back in the ocean to restore them. I also take kids out to learn how to do research in the field, in Joshua Tree National Park, Yosemite, underwater, out swimming with the world's largest sharks, and petting the gray whales of Mexico. Today, I'm going to be talking about glaciers, volcanoes, and wildlife. I have one more presentation before the end of your cruise, which will be all about whales, and hopefully by then all of you will be experts on them. I just mentioned this. Big thing I want to tell everybody, though, is how to orient yourself to my directions. Okay? Everybody point to the bow of the ship. Good. You don't know. Okay. It's that way. Right, he's the Army mapper. That's right. So the bow is the pointy end of the ship. The stern is the flat end of the ship. So when I make announcements over the loudspeaker, I'll say at the bow or the stern. And then starboard and port, okay? Memorize this. Starboard, right side, port, left side. I gave you a trick on how to remember it last night. Here's another one. Left has 4 letters, so does port. That's all you got to remember, right? And then time. Okay, I'm going to use time also to give you direction, which is weird. But everybody point to starboard side, 3 o'clock. Good, you got it. What about port side, 8 o'clock? Back there, yeah. Okay, so whenever I say something over the loudspeaker, you might have to orient to the bow. You'll do a little dance. Oh, yeah, it's this way. And then you'll know which direction I'm talking about when I see a whale or a dolphin or something off the ship. All right, we're going to Alaska, if you didn't know that. We're headed up there right now. We're going to a very small little portion of Alaska. This is all of Alaska right here. Huge state. It's gigantic, right? It takes up 2/3 the size of the rest of the 48 states. We're just going to this little section right here. Right? So you have lots of other experimentation and exploration you can do in Alaska. Up in south central Alaska, the interior, and the far north up into the Arctic Circle. It's a fantastic place. All right, so for today's lecture, I need to bring you back in time just a little bit to the 6th grade, where all of you learned at some point during your educational career about the theory of plate tectonics. So in order to understand that, I need to give you a little bit of earth science here, taking you back to the 6th grade. This is the earth, number one, all right? Foundational information. We live on the outside of the earth's crust, right? We live on this really thin layer. You can see, compared to the other layers, how thin the earth's crust is. We live on the earth's crust. On the earth's crust are these big, giant pieces of solid material. You know, we call it land. The earth's crust, however, also is underwater, right? Because there's land under there too. So that's floating, however, on top of the mantle. The mantle's liquid, if you can imagine this. So the crust is like a giant jigsaw puzzle. It's all in different pieces, and it's floating around on the surface of the mantle. Everybody with me? Okay, good. Here's a side view of what that looks like. So here's the mantle. That's liquid. It's hot, by the way. That's why it's red. It's hot. The crust sits on top of it. The oceanic crust is deeper than the crust that we stand on, right? Because it's at some point 35,000 feet below sea level in the Mariana Trench. And so here's all those jigsaw puzzle pieces. So we can see the parts that stick up above water. Those are the continents that we live on: North America, South America, Asia, Africa. But they actually don't coincide with the plates. They don't have the same shape as the plates. So right now, today, we're going to focus on the Pacific Plate. And those of you who went to Hawaii with me, we've gone over this ad nauseum, because we talked about volcanoes already. But you're going to be the expert today. So I want you to memorize the Pacific Plate. This one right here. Memorize the shape of that. That's what we're talking about right now. Anybody from California? Okay. So where do you guys live? Do you live on the Pacific Plate or the North American Plate? I live on the Pacific Plate, which is the problem for Californians because it rubs up against the North American Plate at a place called the San Andreas Fault. Most of you have heard of that. And that's why we have earthquakes all the time. Okay, so I live on the Pacific Plate. Where my house is on its way to Alaska. In about 3 million years, I'll have Alaskan property. Palm Springs, however, is going to stay put because the part of it sits on the North American Plate. The San Andreas Fault actually cuts right through the middle of Palm Springs. So there's the top of the Pacific Plate, the portion I told you to memorize. Notice how it skirts up along the coast of North America, juts out a little bit where we are. And here's that Pacific Plate again, otherwise known as the Ring of Fire in the Pacific Ocean. All the land that is next to this plate actually has volcanic activity or massive earthquakes. It's called the Ring of Fire. This is the direction, the relative movement of that plate up against all the other plates around it. And as you can imagine, it's a bit violent. When two continental plates move together or apart or rub by each other, it's extremely violent, actually. This is what causes earthquakes, volcanoes, and mountains to move. This is what's making Denali Mountain, the peak, the 20,310-foot peak, get bigger every year. This is what's causing the Himalayas to still grow taller every year. And that's what's causing this area over here, the Tongan Trench, to actually get deeper every year. We went across this on our cruise, and we saw, if you can watch on channel 18, the depth of the sea, and it was about 4,000 meters deep across the whole Pacific Ocean, and all of a sudden it was 8,000 meters deep. That was the Tongan Trench because there's two plates there pulling apart, making the ocean deeper. This is a map that was made of earthquakes since 1898. And the brighter the color, the more magnitude the earthquakes had. Notice the shape. It's no coincidence. It's all along the Pacific Plate, right? Everywhere where that plate comes into contact with another plate, that's where the earthquakes happen. All right, so back to Alaska. I want you to notice another thing. This whole big finger over here. Okay, memorize that. That's the top of the Pacific Plate. That's where there are two plates hitting each other, and something has to give way. Either something's got to go underneath the other, or they got to push up, and they're pushing up. That is a string of volcanoes. It's 130 volcanoes, the island chain called the Aleutian Islands. This is them. From Anchorage up at the top right, all the way out here to Kiska Island. Anybody a World War II buff? Nobody. Oh. Okay. Do you know anything about Kiska Island? Yes, it was one of the only two places in the United States that there was on-the-ground, hand-to-hand combat in the United States during World War II. Kiska Island and Attu Island. Cleveland Volcano is one of those islands out on the Aleutian Island chain. It erupted the last time, April 16, 2016. It's been erupting for 45 years. That was taken from the space station. So there's a lot of ash coming out of that volcano, right? Pavlov volcano erupted last March. It's still erupting. And even 600 miles away to Anchorage, they see ash falling on their cars to this day from the Pavlov volcano. January this year, Borislav volcano, 12,000-foot plume of ash up into the sky. These are kind of off the path, where normal civilization would see them. However, flights do go over that area, right? Flying to Japan, say from Anchorage, or flying to Russia. And so air traffic is actually disrupted from these volcanic eruptions. They have to keep an eye on it for air traffic, because an engine will actually stall out getting that debris, that ash, because it's not just smoke, it's not just water vapor, it's particulates, small little grains of essentially rock that have been melted and being strewn back up into the air that are, and also water vapor and lots of other gases that can shut down the engine of a plane. Anchorage, Good Friday, 1964. Was the biggest earthquake ever recorded in human history. Since then, there's been a larger one in Chile, actually about 3 years ago. But this was the largest earthquake. Luckily, it was Good Friday. Most people were out of their homes. But it was, anybody there? I've actually met a few people that were in Anchorage that experienced it. Devastation, essentially. Not too many people living in Anchorage at the time. There were a lot of military personnel living there. I've met some soldiers who experienced it. But you can see this is just one portion of the city where the land actually just jutted up 6 feet. Just moved, shifted 6 feet. Big holes opened up. You can actually go to a place called Earthquake Park in Anchorage where you can see the waves in the ground that earthquake caused. Now, that's all an earthquake is. It's just waves of energy. Well, these waves were so strong, they actually rippled the ground. So you can walk for about 300 yards over hills that are about 12 feet tall, all the way to the ocean. Amazing. So you can still see to this day. And surprisingly, there were only about 3 people killed in this entire earthquake. And there were several injuries down in Seward, Alaska, actually, because the reverberations were so large, it caused tsunamis and caused some damage in other parts of Alaska. There's a railroad track that was straight. The earthquake moved it about 15 feet. Just bent the steel. All right, moving on to water. The other forming element in Alaska that is ever changing the landscape. Yesterday I said that Alaska is ever changing and everything is interconnected. And this is the place where you can see it. Water is forming the landscape of Alaska by the forces of erosion, right? In several different ways. You're going to have a chance to see water in action in Tracy Arm Fjord. There'll be millions of waterfalls coming off the sides of the fjord. And those waterfalls, of course, are eroding away the mountains. You've been to the Grand Canyon, you've seen it. That's what happens when water erodes away mountains over millions and millions of years. It disappears, right? It carries this, that's called the rock cycle, actually, in conjunction with the water cycle. The water is eroding the mountain, taking with it small bits of the mountain, grinding it up as it bounces down the mountain, and taking it to the ocean, where it'll settle on the bottom, get ground up finer to make beaches that we all like to go and visit, right? So that's the water cycle, is the water falling from the clouds, precipitating down into the earth by form of water and ice, melting into rivers and streams, evaporating and into the ocean, evaporating back up into the sky, and falling again as rain. Everything on the planet is recycled. We're just learning how to do that, right? The Earth's been doing it for 4.5 billion years. Here's a great example of those waterfalls. The tops of the mountains are covered with snow and ice. It's melting. It's spring. So where does the water go? Down. Important concept, because it's going to come in handy in just a second. Water flows down. It's gravity. It's real simple. There's our water cycle, constantly on the earth, right? We don't have any more water than we've ever had. We're never getting any more. It's either in the ground, it's in the air, it's on the ground, or it's in the ice. All right, here's our route. We are on our way right now north. We're not even on this map yet. Yeah, we're way down here. We're on the outside of Vancouver Island all day. It's a 290-mile long island. It's the biggest island east of New Zealand in the Pacific Ocean. It's enormous. So we're traveling up along the island today. We're going to head into the Inland Passage tomorrow, and we're going to hopefully see some glaciers. We're going to Glacier Bay, so we better see some glaciers, right? Glaciers are the largest moving objects on Earth. They're massive. This is important because people don't think about glaciers in this way. They're massive rivers of ice. There's no liquid in them. Massive rivers of ice that form in areas where more snow falls each winter than melts each summer. That's what makes a glacier. Their scale is truly gargantuan. So the key here is that they're rivers of ice, and that it's an accumulation of snow and ice. It accumulates faster than it melts. So it persists over time. Okay? The glaciers of Antarctica are so heavy they actually change the shape of our planet. The glaciers that form the ice cap covering Greenland hold enough ice to encase the entire Earth to a depth of 17 feet. And perhaps most importantly, 3/4 of the world's total supply of fresh water is frozen in glaciers. Are we ever going to run out of water? Absolutely not. It can't go anywhere. Will we run out of clean, drinkable water? No, that's another possibility. But the water will always be here. And most of it we're not drinking. And you're about to see a whole lot of it in Alaska. 10,000 years ago, this is really important. Now we're in the Pacific Ocean, right? 10,000 years ago was the end of the last mini ice age. This is what the Inside Passage looked like. There was 4,000 to 10,000 feet of ice where we're going to be sailing. Okay? As that ice melted, it carved the valleys that we're going to be sailing in. I'll explain how that works in just a second. The tops of the mountains, and you can tell how high the glaciers went, because the tops of the mountains that are pointed did not have ice over the top of them. The tops of the mountains that are rounded were carved by glaciers. So keep an eye out for the pointed mountains. You'll know that's how high the last ice age went up. Approximate worldwide covered area by glaciers. I was very surprised to learn that New Guinea had glaciers. Yeah, Africa. Well, there's some portions of South Africa that are cool and mountainous. And don't forget Kilimanjaro. And Hawaii actually has snow. You know this, right? It has a 13,000-foot peak. So just because it's hot, remember, you go up in elevation, I believe you lose about 5 degrees for every 5,000 feet. So it can get pretty cold. What is a glacier? Okay, Let's go over it. This is taken from the top of Sawyer Glacier, looking down where our ship is going to be in the fjord. Here's the mountain, which is being eroded by the river of ice that is flowing down it. So let's talk about ice fields. The best way for us to visualize this, first off, if you can go on a plane or a helicopter on this cruise, I know they're expensive, but how many times do you go to Alaska? If you can afford it, I know they're about $500 or $400 to get on them. If you can afford it, get up in the air so that you can see this, because you cannot really visually imagine it, except through these photos, what's going on above our sea level, right? So and the best way for us to visualize this is to think of a lake bed, because everybody's seen a lake bed, okay? So imagine the ice field, which is essentially a giant lake bed. It's the tops of the mountains. So we have huge mountain ranges that we're traveling up against right now on the border of Canada and the United States. Huge mountain ranges. And there's snow that's been accumulating there for tens of thousands of years, okay? So imagine that as our lake bed. Eventually, that snow and ice just accumulates to the point where it has to go somewhere. It's not going to continuously grow into the atmosphere, right? It's going to get to the top of the mountains, and it's got to go someplace. So if it was water, you can easily imagine that the water would follow the path of least resistance down the mountains, right? That's easy to imagine. You fill water up in a glass, and it'll spill over. That's what happens to water. Well, ice does the same thing. So the ice accumulates over thousands and thousands of years in the tops of these mountain ranges, and eventually gets to the point where it's got to spill over. So wherever the lowest point is in the ice field, and the Juneau ice field is 90 miles long, it will spill, take the path of least resistance. And unfortunate for that mountain, if it's a little crack or a fissure, it's going to start to flow. The ice is going to start to flow down that path of least resistance, which is really hard for us to imagine. But what that effectively means is, imagine an emery board scraping down through the path of least resistance, because that's how sharp ice is. If you've ever been hit with an ice ball in a snowball fight, you know it's not pleasant. And ice can really carve up your arms and legs and skin, right? It's really sharp. It can erode away mountains. That's how sharp it is. That's how glaciers and fjords are formed. And then eventually it gets to a point where it ends. That's the area of ablation. It'll flow sometimes 40, 50, 60 miles. And eventually it'll get to a water body like the ocean, or a river in which the river is helping to melt it. And wind actually is the biggest melter of glaciers, because winds will blow across the tops of glaciers. And by the way, it's cold on a glacier, if you didn't already know. So take a jacket. Calving is what that's called. When the end of the glacier falls off into the ocean, that's a calving event, where it's actually melted and it's just falling off, being destroyed at the end, the toe of the glacier. And we all want to see this, because you can see a house-sized piece of ice fall into the ocean, make a big splash. Everybody thinks that's cool for some reason. We really like that. So we're hoping to see it, but it can be really violent. You saw those guys in the kayaks? They're cheering, but what they don't realize is there's a tsunami headed towards them. Tidewater glaciers are glaciers that terminate into the ocean. That's what we're going to be seeing in Glacier Bay and also in Tracy Arm Fjord. They terminate into the ocean. There's all sorts of types of glaciers, but those are the ones we're going to be focused on. How do you read a glacial valley? You're going to become experts on glaciers. If you know this one thing, you'll be able to go to any place in the world and say, oh, that valley was formed by a glacier. Anybody ever been to Yosemite Valley? How was that formed? Water or ice? Grand Canyon, we know how this was formed, right? Over millions and millions and millions of years by water. How do we know that? Because it's V-shaped. So very broad and wide at the top, very narrow at the bottom. You can literally swim across the Colorado River at the bottom, right? Not in most spots, but in some spots. You can swim across it. You can see across it for sure. A glacial valley is U-shaped because the glacier ran down through it and carved it. It wasn't being carved by tiny little bits of water flowing through the bottom of it. An entire glacier carved these valleys. So knowing that, whenever you're driving around, doesn't matter where you are. Minnesota has huge glacial valleys. Michigan, huge glacial valleys. Remember, most of the earth was covered with ice at some points during its history. So what is that? A glacial valley, right. By the way, you're going to see these in Tracy Arm Fjord. I took these pictures there. Now, if you get above the glaciers, you'll have a chance to see this. There's one in Glacier Bay that you'll have a chance to see. But you'll see stripes on the glaciers, racing stripes, so to speak. This is really interesting, but you'll only see it from the sky if you're above it. They're dirty. These are actually the lines of debris that came off the sides of the mountain. So take a look here. This glacier came out of this channel here, and it's got all the debris that came with the mountain as it carved by it. As it makes this and hits this other glacier here, it takes a 90-degree turn, and that's the old edge of that glacier. This one's doing the same thing. It's coming down this channel. It's got all the debris that are associated with it. It hits this glacier. It takes a 90-degree turn. That's the path of least resistance, right? So then this becomes one giant patch of debris. These are called moraines. Moraines. And there could be lots of them all coming together, flowing together like a river. That's why I said think of them as streams and rivers, because they're actually flowing together. Look at that. Lots of glaciers meeting together. There can be confluence of 30 or more glaciers meeting in one place. This is an area, to give you a visual, that used to have a glacier sitting on it. That's what's going on underneath the ice. All that debris is grinding against the mountain. So you can see how it could quickly, not quickly, geologically speaking, right, over millions of years. It can erode if it's pulling boulders down the mountain with it, dragging them across the surface of the mountain. This is not our ship. But it's a little smaller. But at the bottom of the glacier, remember, it falls into the ocean. Well, what happens to all that debris that it was carrying down the mountain with it? It's the rock cycle. It's recycling the mountain. It's carrying all the dust and the cobble and the boulders with it. Well, it gets deposited in a big pile at the bottom of the glacier. And that's called the terminal moraine. That's where everything gets stacked up. There's one in Yosemite Valley, if you know where to look for it. It was at the end of the river, or the glacier. We're going to cross the terminal moraine that's now covered with ocean, because the ocean has filled in where the glacier has receded. But they'll make a really big deal about it. We're going to stop the ship. It's going to be at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The ship's going to stop moving. 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon is when we get to Tracy Arm. We're going to stop moving. You'll see a red and a green buoy off the starboard and port side of the ship. And we're going to sit there for a minute while the captain and the pilot kind of discuss how we're going to cross the moraine, because it's about 60 feet deep. Yeah, it's pretty shallow, because it's all rock and sand and grit that was deposited by the glacier 100 years ago when it was out at this area. It's where it sat for a good portion of its lifetime. Now that it's melted back 30 miles, not an issue. It's not dropping anything there anymore. But it comes up about 60 feet, and we have to go over it. And a lot of times, remember, those icebergs are calving off the glacier continuously, and they're coming out of the fjord with the tides, and it'll get caught on that moraine. So we've actually had to sit before and wait for an iceberg to get out of the way, because it was stuck on the moraine. We waited for the tide to change, and then it pushed it out of the fjord. So there's an aerial photo of 5 glaciers coming together. Remember, this is ice, and it's moving maybe a centimeter a year. In some parts, Mendenhall Glacier, where you're visiting, I know that they track it because they're literally sitting right next to it. It moved 10 feet in 1 year. So it moves really slow, except when it doesn't. And then it moves really fast. There's some more racing stripes. This guy's standing on the terminal moraine. So this is the area where all that dirt and grit and cobble and boulders has accumulated, and he's able to stand on it, take a picture of the glacier. Has anybody ever been hiking in the middle of the woods and you just see a random boulder? There's no mountain nearby. How'd it get there? From a glacier. The glaciers deposited the rocks as they were moving, and there could be a boulder in the middle of your forest that was deposited there 10,000 years ago when the last glaciers moved through. Glacial flour. This is the almost, it gives water almost a texture. You're going to see it tomorrow in the fjord. The water's going to look milky because it grinds the rock down so fine, it's like talc. And that talc is so fine, it doesn't fall to the bottom when it mixes with the ocean. So the water will look as if it's stirred with cream. Okay, so you can see here, the bottom of the glacier. It's real milky right out there near the mouth of the fjord. And crevasses. So this ice does not flow smoothly, right? It wrinkles. So it's flowing over geologic time. It's going to be more like an earthquake where it'll, inch forward. And that cracks and creases and folds the ice that's behind it and next to it. So this is what creates those crevasses. This is my husband dangerously too close to one as I'm yelling at him, "Get away from there!" But I took a picture. Yeah, of course. So what is a fjord? A fjord is simply a valley carved by a glacier that is filled in with water. That's where we're going to be tomorrow. We're going to retrace the route of a receding or retreating glacier. It's retreated 30 miles from the mouth of the fjord. And we're going to follow it all the way back and see the succession of the forest. There's the ship in the bottom of the fjord. Now, these walls are 3,000 feet tall. The water underneath the ship is 1,000 to 2,000 feet deep. So the ice was pretty darn deep. There's a little ship there in the middle. Enormous. Voluminous. Here's where we're going tomorrow. So right here, it'll be about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's where the moraine is. So pay attention, go out on the bow and watch that. That's fun. And that's where also we'll decide whether we can go into Tracy Arm Fjord, because, it changes actually daily. The amount of ice that's coming off the face of this glacier, Sawyer Glacier. We've actually gone into this fjord before because we couldn't get into there. So go out on deck. It's fun. Watch, there's something going on. There's a picture, close-up picture of the fjord. There's another boat at the bottom, just to give you a sense of scale. This is a glacier, okay? Looks like land. It's a dirty glacier. This one is eroding so much of the mountain that it's completely black. This is Marjorie Glacier. We're going to see it in Glacier Bay. As you can see, ice-choked area. Ship can't really get through those. We know the story of icebergs and ships, so we'll try to avoid that whole scenario. And I want to point this out to you because you can read the glacial valley walls if you know what you're looking at. Notice the pits and the pock marks. That's all pitted from ice. 10,000 years ago, when the ice scraped by that wall and formed the valley. Notice this. There's nothing growing here yet on this brand new stone because it was just exposed. See the little blue square up there? Take a closer look. Lichen. The first thing to colonize the newly exposed rock when a glacier is retreating. And remember, our glaciers are all retreating except for one in Alaska. There's 10,000 glaciers. There's only one known in Southeast Alaska that's advancing. The lichen can actually digest the rock into smaller and smaller pieces and turn it into soil. This is how we get the evolution of a forest. The forest can't grow out of the rock. It needs some soil to grow in, right? It's happening there. And water helps too. So we're going to enter in the fjord. We'll see old growth forests, 500 years old, at the entrance of the fjord. And as we get closer and closer to the glacier, you'll see the de-evolution of the forest, right? So there'll be big trees, and then we'll see small shrubs, and then we'll see herbaceous little plants, herbs, and then when we get up close to the glacier, just lichen. And then the last couple of years, we'll see the places where it eroded, and it's just bare rock, nothing yet. So we're going to see that whole process. If you're looking for it, and if you're listening on the TV, I'll be pointing it out to you. If you're in your cabin, if you have a balcony, listen on the TV. Otherwise, I'll be broadcasting on the Lido deck. I can't broadcast my voice outside because Tracy Arm Ford Terrors Wilderness Area is the official designation of that area. It's the designation from the United States government. It's a wilderness area, the most protection that you can give to any land in the United States. And it was set aside by the Wilderness Act of 1964 to create a space where the land is untrammeled by man, to allow for thoughtful reflection. Actually, that's in the legislation. It's beautiful. So I'm not allowed to disrupt nature by broadcasting my voice all over the outside of the ship. So I'll be on the inside of the ship. I can talk for about 3 minutes total on the outside decks, where I'll talk to you. If you're out on the bow, you'll be able to hear me. But I'll also walk around tomorrow with a crab hat on. You won't miss me. So I can point myself out to you. This is Mendenhall Glacier, and it has receded about a quarter of a mile over the last 100 years. So this area here, you can see the glacial flower deposits on the sand there. And the first plants to grow is this beautiful flower. It's the state flower of Alaska called fireweed. But you'll be able to see it. It's a nitrogen fixer, so it takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fixes it into the ground so that other plants can grow from that nitrogen source. So why is the ice blue? It looks like this is going to be the last thing I can talk to you about today. Why is the ice blue? Very important, and it's really just physics. You learned it when you were in 5th grade. All the wavelengths of light, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, indigo, are existing with our eyes right now, right? You can see all of the spectrum at the moment. Some things reflect light, and that's what gives them color. It's real simple. So the icebergs that you're going to see that are really blue, or the glaciers you're going to see that are really blue, are simply reflecting blue wavelengths of light. You thought it was going to be something really spectacular. That's it. That's why the floor looks yellow, right, and green and red, because it's reflecting those wavelengths of light back at you. That's it. Nothing really complicated. So you can go home and teach your grandkids about that. Some of these icebergs, remember, tip of the iceberg is on the surface. That's only 10% of the berg. 90% of it is underneath the water. So that's why we don't go near big pieces of ice, right? Some of these are as big as a Walmart. Some of these pieces, yeah. And this little boat right here is kind of in danger because those icebergs can flip over sometimes, causing waves, of course, causing destruction to the small little boat that it's next to. So the captain will pick his battles with the ice. Here we go. This is water. Remember I told you if you're going up on the glacier, Jen's going to tell you about opportunities to go up on the glacier. Take a cup with you so you can taste fresh glacial water. Unless you want to stick your face in there and drink it right out of the glacier pond. But that's filled with water, reflecting back the blue light because it's so clear. So take an opportunity, go walk on a glacier, go enjoy the glaciers. And tomorrow, listen on Channel 19. If you have a balcony, keep your door open so you can hear me. Listen on the decks. On Deck 9, I'll be speaking in the Lido Buffet. A lot of people like to sit in there because it's warm. If you're outside, watch for my crabby hat I'll be wearing. You won't miss it. It's red. It's got claws hanging off of it. And you can feel free to, if you see me on the decks or walking around anytime during the cruise, feel free to stop me and ask any questions because it's my job to make sure you go home informed. All right? So thank you very much today for coming, and I'll see you tomorrow.